And one of the things for me that has been happening again and again, this happened when I was at Accenture, this happened even after when I became a professor, was it's very easy to go with the external signals of success. And when you get there, then you start asking, is this really what I wanted? So I'm on the one hand grateful, of course, for all the opportunities I've had, but part of the reason my career has been a little bit circular is that I think it has taken me time to figure out what I really was passionate about, rather than what everybody said is the great career to be striving for. So while I was a business school professor, at the same time I was looking out, I was saying, okay, what do I really want in life? So I did what a lot of other people, in their midlife crisis do, go for these 10-day Vipassana retreats. I went to Mumbai, I went to Thailand. I volunteered at nonprofits. This is one of those nonprofits where I was teaching domestic helpers in Singapore. In Singapore, about 20% of the population is foreign workers, a lot of which are from India, Myanmar, Indonesia, Philippines. And over weekends, we were conducting classes on entrepreneurship so that when they went back, they could perhaps open a small business, a small shop, something like that. At the same time, then I was trying to figure out what is it more broadly that's happening outside the business world. So I spent a lot of time in a lot of emerging markets. So these are two pictures, one from Myanmar, one from India. India, one is from Kupam with the Agastya Foundation. It's a science education nonprofit. And I was learning a lot about how these organizations are thinking about contributing positively to society, what kind of work they're doing, and all of that. And then in the end, I circled around and I said, okay, so why can't we be having more of these conversations within the business school itself? Because very often the perception of business schools from the outside is, these are the temples of greed, and this is where we brainwash perfectly normal people and train them to think only in terms of making more money and maximizing shareholder value. And I knew that's not how we were on the inside, and we would why should we not try harder to educate the students that were coming in that it was all right to actually think about society, about the world. There's nothing wrong with pursuing a career, even if it's a business career where you're looking to actually prioritize making a positive difference to the world. So that was the genesis of a lot of my work in this direction in the last 10 years. So now I teach at INSEAD a course across programs called Strategy and Investing for Impact, and I'll give you some snippets from that today. And I also run an executive program called INSEAD Social Entrepreneurship Program, which is a global program, but I have run versions of this program actually specifically in India as well, with several organizations based in India. And the starting point for me in a lot of my teaching is this notion of impact. And to make it more concrete, I like to distinguish between intentions and impact. And very often these get confused, which is, it's taken for granted that if you're trying to do good for the world, you're somehow going to naturally contribute more to the world. And I'm going to argue that doesn't, yes, there is a correlation, but it's actually not as straightforward as that. And just to give an example, a lot of nonprofits in Southeast Asia, what they do is they organize these tours in which people from richer countries or richer organizations like Singapore would go on these tours to one of the emerging markets. In this case, this is a picture I took in Cambodia, rural Cambodia, where they have these house building trips where you go for a weekend and you help build houses to where the really poor people would get to live in. So it seems like a good thing to do. You're contributing positively, you're feeling good about yourself. But once you start to think about it, somebody like me trying to build a house, as in that picture, it's not clear the best use of my skills. It's heavily drawing on their resources, which is somebody's buying insurance, somebody's making sure there's mineral water There's somebody's making sure there's an air-conditioned car picking me up from the airport and taking me 5 hours into the rural areas. There are multiple supervisors making sure people like me don't hurt themselves. And almost surely, given the quality of my construction, a real builder came the next day to clean up the mess I'd created, right? So at some level, yes, I felt very good about myself, but was this necessarily the best way I, as somebody trained in business economics, teaching at a business school, would contribute to the world? And I would argue the answer is no. In this case, why did I go then? Well, I went because to learn about the place, not because I was under any illusion that this is the best way I am contributing. I went because I went with my younger son, who's in the lower picture, and to inspire him a little bit about, there's a world out there outside the bubble that we live in. Here in Singapore, he goes to an international school, everybody is well off, and hoping that that would also influence his way of thinking about the future. The impact on the whole, was it there? I would say probably yes, but not from the building per se, but from the fact that they charged me about $1,000 for the trip. And even after all the costs I imposed of them of $300-400, my hope is at least $500-600 was left for some of their work. And so this is the distinction about, good intentions and the actual impact. And maybe the impact would have been much greater if I really was about immediate impact. If I spent those 2-3 days maybe running another program on social impact or social entrepreneurship, which is what I'm good at and where I could influence others. But as I said, I was clear on what I was going for. And as long as that's clear, that's all right. But what very often happens is it's not clear to people who are involved in this way. They feel very good about themselves. They end up only feeding their egos without necessarily serving the world. And that's where I think some of the problems come. Another example, just to make it even more stark. So this is a study somebody had done about paragliding, parachuting in the UK, of people who were raising money for charity. So 50 over a certain period of time across two of these centers, 1,500 people jumped out of planes for charity, and they raised £120,000. Now, a lot of it was paid back for actually paying for the jumps, right? So this is our expensive sport. But even so, you say, okay, this is not bad. They at least did something. But the argument is that sometimes actually doing something can be worse than doing nothing, because a lot of these people were not following the right protocols for how to land. They are not going through the training properly and so on. So they ended up actually costing the UK health system £610,000. So think about it. They raised £45,000 and in the process caused the government system £610,000. So in the bigger picture, for every pound that was raised, about 15 pounds were lost to society. And this admittedly very extreme example illustrates the contrast between these were all well-intentioned people potentially imposing a negative rather than a positive impact on society in the process of just feeling good about themselves, somehow helping the world, right? So this, this simple example raises three sort of very critical questions that come up again and again in the impact space. And whether you're looking at nonprofits, social enterprises, whether you're running it as a CSR program, whether you're running it as a proper business, these issues always come up, which is, what outcomes are you really enabling? Who are you helping and how? How do you know? And how much is your effectiveness in achieving them? If you devoted the same amount of resources to something else, would it have been equally good, worse, or better? And very importantly, then, what are, if any, unintended consequences, in this case, the broken bones that might result, which is a cost. So on the one hand, you feel you're doing something good, but in the bigger picture at the system level, you might be doing more harm than good. And this is an argument very often that's made, by the way. There's a huge literature in economics on the overall impact of international aid, particularly on sub-Saharan Africa. And a lot of people actually argue that on the whole, all the aid over the decades has not only not been effective, it has actually had a negative impact, because a lot of that has kept corrupt governments and dictatorships in power, because that's where the money ends up. And that has actually kept normal progress that sub-Saharan Africa would have had if they were just even left on their own. Not everybody agrees with this point of view, but this is actually a pretty large segment of the economics profession that believes in this point of view. So just stepping back a little bit and having these conversations about impact. So impact is not about making you feel good about on the weekend, during your holidays, during 6 months off, going and hanging out with poor people and feeling good about that, right? So impact ultimately is about how are you contributing to the world. In other words, the question to ask is, if you were not doing what you were doing, how much different would the world be? And if the delta is positive, then your impact is positive, but the delta, as I said, can also be negative. And this is something people don't think hard enough about. And then, of course, the hope is not only is it positive, that it's positive to a large extent, that it's really worth your time and effort to do it. Are you really achieving your best, rather than only feeling good about doing something? So that's the conversation that we usually have when we're talking about impact. So what this leads to is, if you think about it, impact is not a conversation that's separate from everyday life. Everybody has an impact, right? If you look at the definition, and if you imagine the world with you in it versus without you in it, you're going to have an impact. You have an impact on your family, you have an impact in your community, you have an impact on society, you have an impact as organizations. So the impact is always there. The question is, how large is it, and is it positive or negative? And this manifested a couple of years ago when Jeff Bezos at Amazon, he said he's going to give $1 billion to philanthropy. And he was surprised that actually he got a major backlash rather than kudos for the fact that he was going to do philanthropy. Because people said, hang on, you're doing a lot more damage to the world by this drive for efficiency at Amazon, which is really not taking care of the environment. To a point where thousands of employees actually did a written petition. There were walkouts and things like that saying, we really don't care about your philanthropic efforts. What we want you to do is clean up the supply chain of Amazon, so that it's not so obsessed by serving the consumer at any cost that is causing major damage to the environment, right? And this is an example of, one day I by mistake ordered, which was foolish of me in hindsight. I had ordered, among other things, ice cream jar of Ben and Jerry's, which you see there in that picture. And I'm not joking, all of that packaging around it, the 3 ice packs, the foil, and that big cardboard bag, all of that was packaging just for that little box of ice cream. And that highlights the extent of the issue. So if you have to say, if you're a senior manager at Amazon and you want to change the world, well, you probably can make a much larger difference about in what you do, in how you manage your supply chain, as Narayan put in the chat, how you manage your people and all of that, than with sort of, hey, let's do a little bit on the side in charity. And when we are running a business, we are only thinking of money and efficiency, and not thinking at all about the societal consequences of what we do. There's other examples, of course, you're in the tech space, so these are natural examples to think about, from the likes of Twitter to Facebook to Google. And as people even on the inside of the sector admit, right, there are major concerns on how much power people like Zuckerberg now have on what happens in the world. And do you really want your society and all decisions about it to be determined by a handful of people, even if they're well-meaning people, but these are not democratically elected. These are not democratically accountable people, and the consequences of that. And again, people on the inside are aware, they're trying to take their steps. And so, if you are a person who's a manager at one of these places, and you're coming up with the next product, and you're trying to, get kids to kids hooked to your app so that they spend 5 hours rather than 4 hours on the app, because that's going to translate more into ad revenues. A question to ask is, okay, is there a way for you to satisfy obviously your KPIs around ad revenues without having to lead to more addiction of iPhones, which very often leads to depression, even suicide, and major issues about image among teenagers, especially girls, and all of that, right? So there are, even if you're not thinking about it, even if you think, hey, I'm just some a tech manager or a programmer or anything like this in this organizations, a lot of choices you're making in the way you design products, you design your code and so on, would ultimately have societal impact, and it's important to be aware of that. And so, my broader point here is that when we think about impact, we always think about thinking from the heart and doing something that's very visible in terms of we are helping somebody. But a lot of times our impact is thinking like Mr. Spock, who's a character from Star Trek from my generation, who's all about logic and saying, just because you're doing impact doesn't mean that you don't think as carefully about everything the way you would in business. So impact is serious stuff as well as is business. It's not just about, hey, now we are doing good, so we don't have to think how are the outcomes being achieved, what data are we collecting, how are we measuring all of that, and so on. All of that stuff becomes or remains important. So the way I like to think about this is, it's natural to say, if I wanted to have an impact, or let me start with my passion. I think that advice is half correct, right? So which is, yes, of course, it's, if you start with your passions, you're going to have more satisfaction yourself. You'll probably be able to handle the ups and downs of your journey much more, and so on. But you shouldn't forget the other two paths, which are, well, what are your strengths? What is it that you bring to the table? What are your skills? What are you good at? If you're good at accounting, well, actually, it turns out there is enough need for accountants in the social impact space as well. And by the way, one of the biggest things in accounting right now is, how do we account for firms doing environmental damage? How do we set up a formal accounting framework on how firms impact the world in environmental and social outcomes? So anybody can have an impact, as long as I think they take into account not just the passions, but also strengths and what the society needs. And there's a Japanese word that is very popular these days. It's called ikigai, which is sort of finding an overlap of these, which is, passion is absolutely important, but so are the other dimensions. And by the way, this is true even if you're just looking to be an entrepreneur, not just for social impact, right? Which is, you can just say, hey, I want to build a business in X. But if there's no market need in there, and if you don't have a competitive advantage in doing that, that business is not going to succeed. So these are general principles of figuring out, what are you keen on, but also what are you good at, and what is it that's needed out there. And so let me take a few examples from the context of technology, since obviously that's most relevant to you. So, and I'll give you a few examples of ventures that we use as case studies in some of our classes. One is Rwang Guru. It is in the context of Indonesia, where school outcomes are very often not that great, especially for low-income people living in rural areas. And so their goal was, how do we get these kids who are growing up in rural Indonesia, do not have access to tuition centers, either they don't exist or they can't afford them. How do we come up with a tech-based solution that sort of levels the playing field? So on the one hand, this is a business, and Credit Suisse invested in it. It's one of their poster child investments of aligning profits and societal impact. On the other hand, they are very passionately driven actually by learning outcomes. They track how much better are the kids on their platform doing compared with kids that are on the outside, and so on. So another example, these days, plant-based meats is a big thing globally, and in particular, there's two companies, Beyond Burger and Impossible Foods, which is gaining a lot of traction. And their whole thing is it's actually very technology intensive. It's all about taking plant-based foods, but the real technology comes in translating that into a taste that people that are used to eating meat would like. And their point of view in the global context is exactly to making that translation, saying the problem with plant-based meats is that, or plant-based food in general, is that they're great to sell to if somebody is already a vegetarian, but at least globally, the real global warming issue is coming. It's not going to help if you sell just a little bit more vegetarian food to a little, a few percentage of the global population, especially in developed markets, which is vegetarian. What you need is the meat-eating people to start eating less meat. And how do you do that? One is you could try preaching to them. And, these guys say, good luck. Yes, you can do, but a much better way is if you come up with products that they find equally good, in line with the tastes they expect. So if you look at Impossible's website, when they launch these different versions of burgers, they literally have this is version 3.7, right? They're approaching this as a data analysis, software development, product development approach. And it is all about using technology to get the products to a point. And then, of course, in terms of nutrition and price points, also to the same point, in terms of proteins and all of that people are seeking. But that is the focus, which is we are building a business by bringing an excellent product which people would consume, not just because we brainwash them and convince them that it's great for the environment, but they genuinely think it's a good product. And it's a little bit of similar to the story of Tesla and in electric cars. So before Tesla showed up on the scene, a lot of the electric cars were compromises. They were not high on performance. You would have to recharge them after 100 kilometers. Their pickup was terrible, and their costs were high. So Tesla costs are still high, but ultimately Tesla's goal is to come to comparable price point. But very importantly, people are buying Tesla for the style, for the performance, for the pickup, not just because they're saving the world by buying Tesla. So this is another example of technology. One more from the context of emerging markets, and there are similar models in India as well. I mean, initially the payment system using mobile phones, and in the context of Kenya, the most successful one is called M-Pesa, and that became the foundation of something called Mcopa, which was pay as you go for essentially having a solar solution, access to energy in rural areas which are not on the grid, right? And so there's a central database, and which connects with a SIM card in a remote house in a village, and it checks, has the person made the payment for that day? And if they made the payment for that day, the system turns on for that day to essentially have a solar-based lighting system switched on for the day. And the problem it's solving is very often, real poor communities, A, don't have the cash available to buy a product like this all in one shot, and B, they don't have any credit history, so nobody's going to give them a loan. So this becomes a way of giving them a loan effectively, but rather than relying on contracts to enforce it, you're relying on the simple mechanism that if the person sees access to energy come at the same cost as they would have spent on kerosene anyway, right? So it's a game of scale and efficiency at the same time. And then it's all about also using that data to then come up with new kinds of products and services, which is the direction in which Mcopa has gone. So there's a lot of examples where people are using technology to come up with solutions that are also either environmentally or socially solving some societal problem. At the same time, I should say, there's a couple of other things to look out for. One is very often the technological solutions, if they haven't started with a real need, as we said, they end up being toys of engineers in a way. And there are lots of stories if you start digging deep. And this is a book that I very strongly recommend, Geek Heresy. It's written by a person, a Japanese person who was the head of R&D for emerging markets for Microsoft for a while. And his whole mandate was to take all of Microsoft technologies and apply them to development. And what he wrote in that book was a lot of those projects failed, and particularly the projects which started with this very engineering view of, hey, isn't this a cool gadget? It will solve the world's problem, but didn't start with actual analysis of who are you helping and what problem is it solving, ended up not being that successful. So the first row is sort of highlighting then that even if you are in an organization which is genuinely looking to do a impact, certainly there is a lot of opportunities to come up with disruptive models to do that, but you have to be careful in being very clear on what need are you solving and how do you solve it, and starting from that position and being very data driven rather than just going with a engineering intuition of this cool project or product is going to solve the world's problem. And then more recently, as I highlighted in some of my other examples, an issue that's becoming even in mainstream, and that's why I wrote Whatever, right? So even the for-profit companies, if you work in a major large organization, which is just focused on saying, hey, I'm just creating value through market channels, I'm not going to focus that much on societal outcomes. The reality is a lot of what is happening, including through applications of big data, AI, and all of that, is rather than the biases and inequalities that were already existing, in a lot of settings, they are actually being accentuated, right? For example, if your training data in machine learning is coming from a setting where there were certain biases, there was discrimination against women or discrimination against Black people or, some other community. And if that training data is behind the next machine learning algorithm that's being implemented, very often those biases are again going to show up rather than just saying, hey, now that it's in a program, it's not going to be there. And so that's another huge conversation that's happening right now globally. So I noticed that I'm 30 minutes over, so I'll pause here for questions and discussions. And in terms of slides, I have thousands of PowerPoint slides on my computer, so I think I could keep on going on. Happy to have Sagar. Is that a hand raised for questions?
Yeah. So far, your conversation about impact leads me to sort of believe, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is that largely potential solutions here require a more thought out design and thoughtful sort of identification of the problem for which you're trying to solve on society, and evaluation of potential impacts. My question to you is that um, often incentive structures, especially in the private sector, do not allow or incentivize people to have to operate in such a way that you do have a negative impact. So do you not would you not argue that on a large level there's onus in regulation and government to ensure that the impact or these frameworks are in place? Because as a private business, why would I necessarily go ahead and consider these impacts unless they have a very significant maybe impact on my bottom line?
Yeah, absolutely. So two things, right? So it's a little bit of a carrot and a stick approach, right? So what are the carrots for the private sector? The carrots are partly that consumers are becoming more and more sensitive. Even more so, employees are becoming more and more sensitive. So it's very hard at this point, when McKinsey, Accenture, BCG, and all of these come to campus on INSEAD, they're not going to talk about how much money they make and value they create in general for their clients. They talk about how they're changing the world and how McKinsey is the right platform if you want to contribute positively to the world and so on, right? So there are natural pressures from consumers, from employees, from investors, so some of the investors are becoming more and more sensitive about it because the traditional shareholder value maximization model has all been about this hypothetical shareholder who only cares about money, but in the end, shareholders are people as well. and more people, they might not be able to take major compromises for impact, but at a minimum, they want you to think through some of these issues. But so this is the carrot part, but the stick part is absolutely right. And we are seeing this in big tech right now, right? Facebook is having to clean up their act. Maybe a little bit of that might be driven by the goodness of the heart of Mark Zuckerberg, but a lot of it is coming from the fact that they are permanently under scrutiny right now. The regulator is coming after them. Some of these regulations are even more ahead in Europe than in Asia and the US. For example, on environment, on plastics, there has been major regulation in Europe. Right now, a lot of new regulations are just coming on reporting on your performance, for example, on environmental dimensions. And if you don't do it, then you get into trouble with the regulator. The other thing that we are seeing is, so even let's go back to the case of Tesla. So Tesla is still in this crazy growth phase, right? So it's still not making money from selling cars, but it has started making money from the fact that other car manufacturers are having to pay Tesla, because regulation requires car manufacturers to get their emission per car below a certain threshold. And if you're significantly below the threshold, then the companies that are above the threshold need to pay those fines in the form of paying the companies that are below the threshold. So certainly, I mean, regulation is super critical. None of this would happen without regulation. So, but I think to a large extent, it's also about just the threat of regulation. It's not in the sense that a lot of companies are just starting to see the writing in the wall. So even if the regulation hasn't come yet, they're saying, this is going to happen in 3 years anyway. I might as well start cleaning up my act now, and so on. So for example, Google has declared everybody, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, all of these guys have declared they're going carbon neutral, typically by 2030. Google is actually already carbon neutral in one definition, but in terms of generating their own energy, they're still a few years away, and so on. So it's a combination of employees, external pressures, writing in the wall, regulation that already exists, and to some extent, hopefully well-meaning leadership, but the leadership that's still doing this in the constraint of the broader ecosystem.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Very enlightening, especially about, I never considered the internal pressures of employees as well.
Right now they're huge, right? So there have been places like Google has been having a lot of walkouts and pretty much rebellions inside at some point, close to it.
Yeah.
Narayan and then Sachin.
Hi, am I audible? Professor Jasjit, thank you for doing this. First of all, good evening. Connecting through whatever you've taught us today, starting from intentions and impact and walking through Ikigai and then eventually ending up at weapons of mass destruction. I have a two-step question. I'm personally interested in the field of impact and technology. I want to understand that why is it such a less rewarded field when it comes to people actually trying to contribute? It is the less knowns and the less frequented who are actually making things work, and the biggers, they're just trying to contribute just because they have to. And the other thing is that 5, probably 10 years from now, when the AI for good and AI as in the entire industry of AI is getting into technology, where do you see us creating the most impact, in which sector of development, and where should we be, posing ourselves as next leaders?
So do you mind clarifying your first question again? You said, why is it a marginal field? Is it?
Yeah, it is less rewarded, and it is mostly looked down upon. The notion of helping people is just reduced down to one of those things which you can also do, and not the things which you should do, because you wouldn't get much out of it.
So I think to some extent that's true, but I think it's changing, right? So I've been working with, so there are many organizations, some of which are formally calling themselves impact investors, others that might not be formally calling themselves impact investors, but are specifically investing with a lens of impact, recognizing that there's huge opportunities both in terms of solving problems and ultimately in terms of money that's actually waiting to come in, as long as they know there's credible evidence that you're not impact washing. I think one of the biggest challenges in my view still is, but I think it's in the process of getting solved, is whether you're just saying that you're helping the world or whether you're actually helping the world, right? If you go on the website of any company, the website, especially what they write in their mission and vision statement, every businessman would look like a saint, right? And the real challenge becomes, well, what's the difference between this and something else? So let me give a few examples. I did have later, I think. Okay, so here's one example that I've been looking at. Let me see. No, that's fine. So this I was, as I was preparing for this seminar, I looked into this a lot. It's a super cool company. It's called Region Network. And what they're saying is, let's use cutting edge technology, right? So it's a combination of AI and blockchain. And so the problem they are solving is, right now, by regulation, a lot of companies like Apple, for example, right? So when Apple says or Microsoft says we want to be we want to be carbon neutral, they have to, at a minimum, show that they are now buying enough credits from somebody to say, you know, we are causing a certain amount of global warming, but we are enabling enough steps to make up for the damage we are causing. Now, this becomes a completely data and measurement problem. If they are not yet solving it, they need somebody to solve it, right? So they need to pay somebody to do the equivalent good of the harm they're doing. Who would they pay? They would pay somebody like Region Network. What is Region Network doing? And, you know, as I said, this is a very new field. These guys are still small because this space is still rapidly evolving. But Region Network is saying, okay, we can measure random soil samples in a farm to tell you how much carbon is being captured in the soil based on the best practices that are being adopted, right? So the hope is, as these farmlands, and in this case, they did a contract with a huge one in Australia, once they adopt certain practices on how they manage cattle, how they do grow crops, how do they manage their grasslands and all of that, it's going to affect the carbon that gets captured. One way you can measure that is you can take random samples, but that's just not going to be enough practically to implement it at large scale. So they said, we'll take random samples, we'll use that to train large scale data algorithms that are relying on basically massive photographs being captured by satellite. So now you suddenly have satellite data for all of Australia. You put in there, what does a pixel look like when there's more carbon being captured versus less, and train it. So that helps you now say, over a few years, has this farm now significantly improved in how much carbon it's capturing? Now, the next step of this is saying, how do you credibly make sure that that farm is not selling the same carbon credit to 6 people? Well, you do it through a blockchain, right? And this is where it comes in, which is all of this data goes into sort of around environmental services is being captured so that nobody can double count, because double counting is a huge problem otherwise, which is, you know, I don't want company X and company Y and company Z all to be buying the same positive carbon and offsetting their negative carbon against it. So, I mean, this would be an example of the kind of stuff that's happening right now at a massive scale. And I think that's very interesting. So similarly, the equivalent of that in the finance space is blockchain being used basically to bring all people that were excluded from the financial network in, right? Poor people don't have credit cards that are captured in MasterCard and Visa transactions. But it turns out a lot of them are taking really small scale loans, for example, with microfinance organizations, which are not available globally. If you made it available through a blockchain again, then in principle, everybody has a credit history, right? So this would be another example of technology being used to give credit history and financial inclusion to people that wouldn't have it. And so the vision of Kiva has changed from historically, they said we are going to enable, microfinance organizations built on models like Grameen Bank. But now their vision is moving increasingly towards, actually, we are going to move towards a world where microfinance organizations become irrelevant because everybody has a credit history. So the bank will be willing to lend to the poorest person once there's a credit history, and technology-enabled lending would make it very easy to do it. So I think these would be the kind of examples that I would give on practically how they're doing. Now, these spaces, as I said, are new spaces. A lot of times, I think it's a combination of the measurement systems and credible strategies not being there, combined with investor education on things like that, right? It's hard. This stuff, you need a venture capitalist to understand this, or private equity to understand it. But now more and more people are getting into this space.